Arsenal beat Manchester City. Mikel Arteta has finally beaten Pep Guardiola. But my God, Jon Mackenzie, wasn't that a boring game? Why?
Well, yeah, it depends if you like out-of-possession stuff. If you like out-of-possession stuff, there was things to enjoy about this game.
I think it's mildly interesting.
Yeah, and I'm going to be honest.
Yeah.
I enjoy out-of-possession stuff, but
I know
this was also a hard watch, I'd say, after the initial interest of seeing what was going on. Because
but why is it such a hard watch? Let's go straight into it. Just tell me why it was boring. What did they do? Yeah,
so I think that what we've seen from this game is maybe the final piece of the jigsaw that has been building over the last couple of seasons, which is the games between Manchester City and Arsenal. Now, you'll remember that the last few games haven't exactly gone in Arsenal's favour.
So it's a 1-1 draw in the Community Shield, but they won on penalties. They lost 4-1, they lost 3-1, they lost 1-0.
Yeah. And I think that the 4-1 loss was quite instructive in showing the problems that can emerge in the way that Arsenal like to play football, because as we know, Arsenal really like to press high up the pitch. They like to destabilise the opposition in their build-up phase. And so what we see is them actually going in these scenarios where they end up player for player really high up the field. The problem is if you do that, then you are obviously leaving yourself exposed at the back. So Arsenal generally use what I like to call a hybrid system. Hybrid because you move between two different systems. This high pressing phase where you go man to man, but then a more, I guess, conservative zonal system where you block out maybe in a 4-4-2.
This doesn't look very conservative.
yeah, this is not very conservative right now. But the thing is that in the last few games, I think what Pep Guardiola has seen in Arsenal's approach is that if you can bait them forward in the press, it actually requires some of maybe their more defensive midfielders to jump up to mark players to make sure they're not free, so that you've not got easy out balls to play through in the build-up. And what that then does in turn is, as you've shown already, it opens out space in this kind of area here. And what Pep Guardiola has been trying to do when he's played against Arsenal in previous games is to really hit this area when they're jumping forward. So when they're in between the phases of going high or dropping deep, really try and find these spaces. So you may remember the 4-1 game, the first goal in that game. You've got John Stones right there.
I do remember that, yeah.
He gets put under a lot of pressure by Edison, who plays a horrible ball. He's facing the wrong way, turns around. The press is super high. So Arsenal have jumped. Obviously, there's different players, but they've jumped really high. Stones just plays the immediate out ball just because he's under so much pressure. It goes to Haaland.
Now, in theory, this is not a bad thing to do because you're making them clear the ball long. So in theory, you should be able to then push up, win the ball back and recycle.
Yeah. What happens is that holding is on Haaland. Haaland takes an incredible touch and plays an incredible pass to Kevin De Bruyne. Yeah, so he's not on the field here. But
he can be Lewis today.
He can be Lewis. Okay, so he receives the ball, runs through, and then plays this incredible finish into the bottom corner. That breaks the deadlock. But throughout the rest of the game, Man City were able to exploit this movement that Arsenal have between jumping high, dropping into more of a conservative block, opening out that space and really hurting them.
And I guess because they take the lead first in that game, that also changes maybe not the game state, but I guess it does, right? It changes the game state because now Arsenal have to push to get back into it, which in turn means they have to take more risks, which will leave that space behind. Yeah,
the same thing happened in the next game, in the Community Shield, because you may remember in that game, we saw a situation where Arsenal were actually directly able to pull the defensive player out of position with Foden dropping deep to pick the ball up. It was actually Thomas Partey in that game, but he steps right up on Foden. Foden receives the ball from this kind of area, is able to roll, and then he's in this space. And I think Man City end up with 4-on-4 with lots of space to attack, easy spaces to exploit with passes, and that was where the goal came from there as well. So we're seeing that happen in the last few games, the ability to open out that space and exploit it. And so what I think was the blueprint for this game for Mikel Arteta was to make sure that this space didn't open out.
And it didn't, and that's why largely it was slow. And another thing you can see in how it wasn't opening up was that when the goalkeeper received the ball in, say, a build-up situation, we'll take Stones off the pitch, I'll get rid of him here, leave that space there because it sort of makes sense, is what we see often is the goalie just standing on the ball. And this time Arsenal aren't taking the bait whatsoever. So both teams doing this. You had Raya on the ball to standing, waiting, really slowing it down. I wonder how long crowds actually don't get bored with that for. But it kind of, this is the thing, they're both desperate not to make the first mistake because the game has been decided by a mistake in the last few games. Like Tomiyasu made an error in one of the previous ones which let De Bruyne in to score. That's one of the things. Now, we're talking about the last piece of the puzzle. Is that in the recruitment that Arteta's taken in, or is it in the tactical plan?
Well, I think there's both aspects are important here. So let's talk through the tactics first. So Arsenal ended up doing what I would call maybe a high block. It was not really a high press because they're not necessarily jumping man-to-man in every scenario. But essentially, Ederson has the ball, pushes up into the front line. You have the two centre-backs quite wide. Now, what you have is you have Nketiah just orientating himself to Diaz here. So he's going to make sure if the ball goes to Diaz, he can put him under pressure.
Yep.
But he's also going to make sure that he's not too far away from Ederson, because Ederson also technically counts as a build-up player here. You then have Erdegaard here, who's, again, he's going to keep an eye on Ake for the same reason that Nketiah is. But also, Arsenal are going to be hyper aware of the fact that Man City like to build up with pivots. And the idea is that you use those pivots to build up through the middle. So Erdegaard is going to stay with Kovacic. Nketiah is going to be a little bit further forward here. But then we're going to have Declan Rice as one of the eights pressing up on Bernardo, who's is the pivot in this scenario, but also Kovacic is dropping in as well. So Erdegaard is going to keep an eye on him. So what you're making sure is that these two are orientating themselves around the pivots to make sure there's no free space. But they have the ability, again, obviously if the ball comes in here, you can have Ake stepping up, Rice may come across, Jorginho may step up. But the other idea here is, so this is all about not allowing easy build-up through the middle. But the other idea here is that obviously if you're going to be aggressive with someone like Rice stepping up here, you are opening out that space a little bit. And so to make sure that is not completely open, and you've got Jorginho here sort of patrolling, so he's keeping the space occupied. In certain scenarios he may jump up, but you don't want that to happen if possible.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing is
even
Arsenal,
just being there as well puts off the player playing the pass.
Sure, yeah. Arsenal actually use really, really narrow, wide players here to just make sure that, again, if any space opens out here, they can drop in and help out. And actually what ended up happening is that they were pretty happy to let Walker and Guardiola have space in the wide areas. And I think that was just a plan by Arteta, because he recognised that the bigger threat here is allowing space in the middle.
Yeah.
Let's allow Walker, Guardiola, not the most dangerous attacking players that City have, to have space. We can readjust if the ball comes out here, but we're not worried too much about them. What we are trying to make sure is that the overload is in the middle.
And you limit their options as well, because the other thing, like what I notice is quite a lot, is when, so the block's there and they're waiting for City to, well, like we're saying, they're trying to bait the press, they're not pressing. When the ball does move, then they try and show the ball wide, so the ball ends up with, say, Guardiola here. And his only real option is to try and carry it past. Really risky, because if you turn the ball over, you can suddenly try and attack them. Also, if your only real passing option is down the line, that's kind of harmless, you kind of find, because you've got Foden here, might get tackled, whatever. So they're limiting their options by doing this, because everyone's guarded in the middle. Then you clear the ball, you can win the ball back. That's kind of what we saw from this. But another thing we have with the way that Arsenal were defending against Man City, with all of this, is that in the past, obviously, Haaland's been really dangerous getting in behind, especially at the goal we mentioned earlier, where him and De Bruyne combine. So when you got Haaland being able to make these kind of runs in behind, and they can maybe get the ball to someone in midfield and they can try and play the ball through for him, what I noticed Arsenal were doing, and this is clearly trained, is that when someone had the ball in a position where they could spring the pass through whoever it was, whoever had it, as soon as that action looked like it was likely to happen, this back line would instantly step back about 5 metres just to make sure that if he were to get to full speed, he would still have this back line to deal with. So they're not playing offside against him, they're trying to make sure that they recognise his strengths, which are running past him. There's one example, he does get in the ball and Saliba just bounces him to the ground. So that's kind of them taking care of that major threat. So taking care of Man City's build-up play through the middle, which is a big threat. They've taken care of Haaland, which is a big threat. And then there's nothing really with Man City can do other than wait for a mistake, which doesn't happen because Arsenal's entire game plan is to lock everything down and not make any mistakes.
Yeah, basically. And again, we were talking before about not wanting this space to open out. Make sure Jorginho is there. If the ball does come across to this side, then you can have Rice coming across because Trossard is so narrow.
Yeah.
So he can cover this space again. So it's all about just blocking out the middle and then just leaving the space in the wide areas, but having routes to be able to stop it from being too dangerous.
Now, how about Man City? Because I think they were very similar. Like, one of the reasons they kind of cancel each other out is because they were effectively doing the same things to each other. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, if you look at the build-up structures that both teams are using and the out-of-possession structures, they're pretty much exactly the same, which makes a lot of sense because, these are two managers who have spent a lot of time thinking about football together, talking about how football is played and thinking about how to cause problems for opponents. So I think no surprises here that what we see from Guardiola is very similar to what we see from Mikel Arteta. I actually want to just flick to show you two screenshots.
Oh yes, I like a screenshot.
We've already talked about how Arsenal are approaching in this high block phase. Yeah. So here's an example of this. We've got Ederson with the ball. Here's Nketiah, who we said sitting between the centre-back and the goalkeeper.
Now, the pedants will say that it looks very much like Nketiah is pressing here.
Yes, and I mean he is. Yeah, obviously there is pressing happening here. This is still about trying to control what the opposition are doing. But in this situation, we've got Nketiah just trying to force the ball onto the Manchester City left. As you can see, everyone else is player for player. So we've got Erdogan, who is technically on the front line of the press along with Nketiah. He's on Kovacic, one of the pivots. He can also get across to Ake if he needs to. And then we've got Declan Rice, who's on Bernardo Silva here. He's stepped up. But as we can see, two really narrow forwards here. So Gabriel Jesus and Trossard here just coming super narrow, allowing the fullbacks for Manchester City to sit in space. But again, this is not a really aggressive high press. This is just making sure that everyone's covered and that the middle is not going to be opened out. Now, if we go to the first slide here, this is now Arsenal trying to build up in the same way. Centre-backs spread wide. Here's Haaland in the same situation as Nketiah was. So keeping an eye on these two. We've got Lewis here, who is on one of the pivots, but he's also keeping an eye on the other centre-back. And then Kovacic has stepped up onto Jorginho, the other pivot as well. And again, down the bottom here, Phil Foden, one of the wide players, just an incredibly narrow position. So almost identical, I'd say. There's a few little differences here and there. So if we go to the board here, we can see here's Haaland, here's Lewis, here's Kovacic, keeping it all very tight around the pivot players and the centre-backs.
Yeah.
We've got the wide players really narrow, blocking up that space, because sometimes Bernardo may have to step forward, so you want to have these two players in very easy access to be able to help out in the middle so that that space doesn't open out. And again, we've got Arsenal, I think, playing with quite narrow forwards, again, in the same way that Manchester City did. And actually, Pep Guardiola was asked about this after the game. Why did you play the players you played in the middle? And he said, I wanted players who were good at protecting the ball in the middle. So Kovacic, Bernardo and Lewis, all very good tight space players. Maybe not as good as they've had in the past, but that was the thinking behind it. And then the wide players, he said he wanted to have players who could actually receive the ball on the turn and attack the back line, which is basically saying, I want to build up in the middle, create space in between the lines, find those players who can then turn and attack the back line. I think the same is true for what Arteta's doing here, right? So he's got Jesus and Trossard as narrow forwards, rather than you might usually have Martinelli and Saka.
Do you think it would have been the same if Saka had played? Because Saka would normally come off the wide areas, especially in build-up, which might have changed the way they look possibly, and maybe Jesus would have started on the left? Yeah, and obviously they brought on Martinelli in the second half, right? So we then started seeing him with maybe a little bit more space and a little bit more guile to create in the wide areas. But as we said, I think Arsenal this season have shown that they can progress the ball into the wide areas. The big question is, how do you then convert those ball possessions in wide areas in the final third into dangerous chances? Well, they kind of struggled out this season, all the season. We look at non-penalty expected goals. So, sure enough, Arsenal are high up the table and they score lots of goals, but they've had a lot of penalties. So, you look at the underlying numbers, which doesn't tell you everything, but what you see with non-penalty expected goals is that Arsenal are just slightly worse than West Ham at creating valuable chances to score. Now, of course, to create penalties, you have to have strong control of the game and be in positions to, we don't have to, but mostly you being in control of games to get in those positions. But I've watched every Arsenal game so far this season. They don't seem as fun as last season, to me anyway. Like the fun zone is this is the fun zone in the middle of the pitch, right? That's where all the fun is, but they're kind of removing it by putting everyone there. So they're not as much fun. But they get results like this by being better at being defensive. So is this a part of a strategy? So they know that they've lost to Man City each time. This is probably Arteta working out, if you lose, that's 3 points gone, and if you draw, that's 1 point gain. So lock it down and wait for the mistake. Is that fair to say? You mentioned the recruitment in the summer earlier on, and I think this is what it comes down to, right? I think Arteta is acutely aware of the fact that Man City were able to generate and exploit space in those lines between the midfield and the defence. And so a lot of their recruitment was designed to be able to shut down some of these problems, right? So Declan Rice, probably the best player in the world at actually monitoring space in these kind of areas. So, he's great to have on your team. We talked about Jurriën Timber as well, who started out this season. He probably would have started instead of Zinchenko. Exactly, he just gives you a little bit more defensive solidity in this kind of position, especially if you're not going to use Zinchenko inside as much, which they didn't really do at least in the first half of this game. So there's an argument to be made that this is like the final piece of the puzzle of Arteta's big question of how do I beat Pep Guardiola? How do I avoid them being able to exploit these sorts of situations? But I do think it does raise bigger questions, right? Because this game very much ended up a stalemate because both teams were
attempting to do roughly the same thing, right? Which is block out the middle, make sure the opposition didn't have any upside. But the downside for them was that it meant that they also got blocked out of the game because it just ended up with a lot of
I want more fun. I want more open chances and lots of end-to-end football. But if you do that, you run the risk of conceding.
I mean, and in this game, it worked out all right for Arsenal because they stayed in the game long enough to then take the chance when it came. But, had Nathan Ake scored his chance early on in the game, this could be a completely different conversation we're talking about now, which is, are Arsenal too defensive this season? And I think this is the big question about Arsenal now, is that if they've approached their summer transfer window by asking the question, how do we make sure that Man City don't hurt us and we can beat them? That's fine as long as you're beating Man City, but the league I don't think is won by just beating the other team who is your rival. The league is won by being consistently good.
You have to beat all the other teams.
Yeah, exactly, all the time. And I think what we've seen so far from Arsenal this season is that they've actually dampened their attacking credentials a little bit. Now, there's arguments to be made that that's partly to do with teams now treating...
There's a lot of arguments here.
There are a lot of arguments. But a lot of teams will be treating them with more respect, so they will be sitting deeper and becoming, forcing them to break down low blocks, which wasn't happening as much last season. But I also think that the personnel that they brought in now has impacted their ability to generate these dangerous attacks through the middle. They are ending up drifting into the wide areas. And I just don't think that they're a team that really suits wide area attacking. I think you want to get them in the central spaces. They've got good ball players who can finish from the middle, and I think that's going to be the big question about Arsenal this season.
So if we answer our own question that we posed at the start of this chat, was how Arteta finally beat Guardiola. It is by locking down the middle and taking all the fun out of the game of football in order that you win the game, hopefully, if you get a chance and you take the chance.
Yeah.
I mean, it worked.
It did.
Yeah. Good old football. Soccer.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.